But I think it's kind of one of those things where, yeah, if we get back to the idea of justice and sort of why it might be necessary, it's we think like, well, kind of like when we think of like crime and punishment, whenever there's a lack of punishment, or we think that the punishment doesn't suit the crime, like it's severely underwhelming. An example I can think of is like where somebody who, let's say somebody drunk driver kills one or two people because they drank, the driving under the influence, and then they only get like a slap on the wrist. Like that happens, seems to be happening quite a bit recently, and in some court cases around here anyway. But where they only get like a couple years, like they take a plea deal and stuff, and then obviously for the victims' families, they're like, well,
Where's the
a year,
justice?
yeah, exactly. Where is the justice? Like they can only get like, if usually it's for second degree or first degree murder, you get like life. Like I know second and first degree, I think is 20 to 25 years, so pretty much life in prison. But they try to, obviously they try to nail them on the lesser charges so they can say that something was done. But the families look at it and say, well, there's only 1 or 2 years. That's how much this
Yeah, that's
person's life,
nothing was
or
worth.
right. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like that. That's why there's this necessity of like, well, if we think about God's nature as good, like there's the problem of evil, but like obviously we know there's quite a bit of evil in this world, and obviously God knows it too. So it's like, well, there has to be a punishment, right? Like things have to be righted, because we can't just let, if he's, it's kind of like when we say to the law courts and the judges, it's like, okay, administer justice. Like you can't let injustice go unpunished. So when we look at God, if we're punishing people for injustice here with our own sort of systems, then when we look to God and we say, well, why are you doing the same thing? It's kind of like it's like hypocritical in a sense, because we need to, if we want to enforce justice and morality here, then it's kind of like, well, we can't accuse God of doing so either. Like he needs to, that's kind of why hell is almost necessary. Well, it is necessary in a sense if he has a far greater perspective than we do, and he sees the full gravity and the extent of the evil that's going on, then obviously the natural conclusion is, yeah, well, there needs to be some sort of punishment mechanism, except basically God is, in that case, is he's not only the judge, but he's the jury and the executioner, so he's three in one. Whereas, well, that's that's like a song, but anyway, like a hymn you'd sing in church, three in one, but anyway, it's a different context. But yeah, so it's basically like, instead of having a judge here and then the jury of your peers and then the police or whatever, whoever the arm of government is that enacts punishments, it's God is three in one, and hell is sort of the means of enacting justice or punishing people. So it kind of seems like we, as harsh as it sounds, there needs to be some sort of punishment mechanism. Like if you were God, if you were looking down and saying, yeah, like there's great evil, I can't let this evil go unpunished. And that's the same, and the human notion is pretty much the same. And one could argue that it derives from, obviously God is the ultimate lawgiver.
But then why didn't he
So,
just simply make people flawless to begin with? Why, like, if
yeah.
he creates his beings knowing that they're flawed and he says, oh, well, look at them doing flawed things, I should punish them for living within their nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, that'd be like if you could somehow create a dog and then you punish it for, like, barking and, like, peeing on a fire hydrant. It's like, you designed it that way. That's just what it does. That's just how it is. Like, whether you like it or not. So that doesn't really make any sense. And then the problem with punishment lies in it seems that in the Bible, but also in other religious texts, that the punishment to go to crime doesn't seem to be what most people would consider to be an evil act. So it would seem that even like your average person who tells like some white lies, or who tries, like, for example, they'll tell some white lies, or they don't do overtly evil things. Like they don't murder people, they don't steal, they don't, what else would be, they don't commit adultery or all these things, which you think, well, if somebody murders, then yeah, they're going to hell for sure. But if you take like the average person who's no saint, but there's certainly no mass murderer either, it's kind of like, well, why are they being punished? Like they're just your modest, average people. Why would they be thrust into hellfire? What was the point? They're decent people by all standards. They're not like overwhelmingly generous, but they're not evil either. They're just trying to live normal lives like the rest of us. Why would those people need to be punished?
Yeah, that's
because where's the middle ground? It's like, because it seems like you either go to heaven or you don't. It's like, okay, well,
it's a dichotomy.
are you good enough or aren't you? It's like, okay, if you're not, it's like, if you're not the top 1% or like 0.1%, however small the percentage would be, it's like, well, what about the overwhelming majority of people who who are decent.
Well,
They're
that's, I
decent
know,
people.
that's kind of the same
That's
thing
kind of
too.
what I have. That's what I have trouble reconciling, because it's like, well, yeah, a lot of people, when you go out in public, most people you encounter in life, or a lot of people you encounter in life, they're just average in that they're just doing what you expect typical people to do. They're going to work, they're going to school. They're probably thinking about watching like TV or playing games or hang out with friends on the weekend. Like, they're just doing like pretty typical. Their hopes and dreams are kind of what you would expect human beings to have. Like, they want a better job, they want nicer clothes, a nicer car, they want to find love or romance or whatever. They're just like your, if you just envision your typical person, it's like, well, why would they need to be thrust into eternal punishment? Like, what major crime did they commit in their lives to do that?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like that thing where I was reading up on some posts, and it's kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, obviously, like, specific verses I can reference in the Bible, so it's like, yeah, many are called, but few are chosen. Then it's kind of like, like,
well, then what happens to the rest?
It's like, wide is the path to destruction, but narrow is the path to life, right? So it's kind of references that idea, yeah, where there's like, there's like God's elect, where there's very, very few will be saved, and then the rest will be damned, right? And that's kind of,
why would you create beings just to damn them in the first place?
Like, like, I remember, as I remember that, like, it's kind of hard to reconcile that too, where, yeah, because you say, well, I'm trying to be a good person, I'm trying to do the best that I can, and whether that's sort of to uphold certain moral standards.
Well, yeah,
but then it's kind of like, and then also kind of a challenge I could think from somebody, yeah, is like, even as somebody who's more or less believes the scripture and believes the model as well, it's kind of hard to think about that too, because then somebody can say, well, what's the, if this is one standard of morality, well, then what makes it sort of more correct, than the others, right? So it's kind of like, it's like a comparison of all the religions. It's like, okay, well, what makes, let's say, Christianity more correct than like Buddhism, or all these things, and we can get into all of that, like Taoism. I can talk about it, like, from a purely scripture point of view, but then people will say, well, outside of the Bible, like, how do you sort of justify?
Well, because the thing is, with any religion, you have to part of like the faith or whatever is, you have to just accept the assumption, like, more or less at face value. It's kind of like, there is a greater force in the universe named God, and God is all good. Like, we all have to be on the same page and agree with that. It's like, yep. And then we can branch into the more, because if you don't accept that at face value, you say, like, if there is a force in the universe, I think God or the force in the universe is more so just chaotic, that things mostly just don't really happen for a reason. That's why there are accidents, for example. It's just chaotic. We live in like a chaotic neutral world or whatever, where it's indifferent to us. Then, yeah, because if you don't accept that notion, you just say, I don't think things are really good or bad. Like, I just think I envision in my mind that it's good or bad. Like, if someone dies in a car crash, or they got hit, there's like a hit and run, they're the victim of a hit and run, you would think, like, if you believe that there's no God and things they're just chaotic, because we do live in a chaotic world, you think, well, there was no reason that happened. It was just unfortunate that my friend was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, because someone could say, like, no, I don't believe that the force in the universe is good or bad. It's kind of indifferent. It's kind of like, well, when a hurricane happens. Like, it doesn't have a reason why. It just happens sometimes.
Well, that's kind of like it's like a stoic perception of the world, where it's like, yeah, well, the
world doesn't care if your friend got killed in a car crash.
But it's more like what I can take from it is where it's like the assigning of, it's like who
we assign,
like value. Lucretius and obviously Epictetus has probably talked about this at length too, where it's like, yeah, there's no really like objective good or bad. Well, like,
we assign
what's that? No, it was Seneca. When I was reading his letter 84 and stuff, he was talking about, like, yeah, it's how we assign things. Whereas the Stoic, there's more like, there's preferred indifference and there's dispreferred indifference. So things like torture, he uses the example of torture, where it's like, those are obviously dispreferred indifference, but we're still indifferent to them regardless. So that means, like, they're not inherently bad. Yeah, maybe, like, obviously they're, for most people, they think, well, obviously torture or like some sort of duress and suffering is a bad thing, but it's kind of something like, where if you're somebody who's a Stoic, you're like, well, I'm not swayed by either like good or bad. I'm moderate. Everything's moderate, so I can tolerate all of these extremes, because I don't think, oh, this is really good, this is really bad.
Or if you take a more simplistic example, it's like a lot of people, their mood or how they choose to feel, how they don't choose to feel, but also part of how they choose to feel is, like, you take something as simple as the weather. like, oh, it's not sunny today, so it's a bad day today. So they'll think to themselves, it's rainy and dark, so it's a bad day. Whereas for somebody else, they might say, well, whether the weather is good or not doesn't matter to me. Like, I value whether my day is good or bad, I determine based on like my productivity or what I did that day. Whereas for other people, they say it doesn't matter what I do today. If it's like a really sunny day, then it's good because it feels good, and if it's a rainy day, it doesn't feel good, so it's a bad day. It's kind of like, well, is the weather good or bad? Like, well, good or bad, you can say, well, objectively, like, if it's sunny to a certain degree, that helps like plants and crops grow, which is good, but the rain is also needed for that. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about good or bad as in human beings and how they feel about it. Yeah, so it's like, well, it's just like the weather, it just is. Like, your opinion of it doesn't matter. If it's sunny, it's sunny, and if it's rainy, it's rainy.